first of all, thank you for allowing me to talk a little bit about my book. Obviously, I taught preaching for 20 years, and after using a variety of different textbooks for my class, it became clear that I wanted to be able to put down into words the way I've been teaching my students for 20 years. And so I like to say that the book is the product of listening to about 5,000 mediocre sermons from my students. And having listened to a lot of mediocre sermons, I learned, I think now I know what are the components of a good sermon. And I would say this. The book is structured around four main parts that I think are the main components of a good sermon. First, the first part of the book describes how to discover the truth of the text according to the human author. Secondly, the second part of the book is how to discern Christ in the text according to the divine author. So let me just start there, because that first half of the book of discovering the truth of the human author, but also discerning Christ according to the divine author, is both kind of the interpretation side of things, whereas the second half of the book is about communication. So let me just talk about the interpretation side of things in both discovering the truth of the text, but also discerning Christ in the text. I think good sermons have to do both. You need to do justice in terms of your interpretation to both what the human author wrote, but also what the divine author wrote. I actually believe that both were important. That the human author, be it Moses or Paul, had certain gifts, skills, language, histories, backgrounds, as well as occasions and audiences that prompted what they wrote. So our job in our exegesis or interpretation is to recognize all of those elements and to interpret it to the best of our ability. So that's kind of a human process. What did Moses mean when he wrote this in Exodus? Why did he write this to Israel? What were the unique Hebrew words that he used? Why did he use narrative instead of poetry? All of those linguistic and literary analysis, as well as life-setting analysis, needs to occur to get to the truth of that text as Moses gave it to Israel. But that's only part of the interpretive process. I actually believe that the scriptures, all scriptures, were divinely inspired by the Holy Spirit. That in addition to all these diverse authors over diverse time and diverse languages, there is a unifying author with a unifying message. That the Holy Spirit actually had a desire to have one central message, a message of salvation through one primary agent of salvation, Jesus Christ. And so while Moses may not have known all the details of how his stories point forward to Jesus, nonetheless, God did. Because God was the designer of the entire scriptures. And then the New Testament, the Apostle Paul, looks back at the work of Christ. So whether you're looking forward to Christ or looking back at Christ, the central message of the entire Bible, I believe, is that God redeems a people for himself through the person and work of Jesus. It's essentially the gospel, the good news of salvation. So then our task is not only to discover the truth of the text according to the human author, but also to discern the gospel, Jesus Christ, according to the divine author. And I think, to answer that question, I think a lot of sermons today, at least in terms of its interpretation, basically does one thing or the other well, but doesn't really combine both aspects or both layers into the interpretive process. So that's the first thing I would say. And let me just talk a little bit about the second part of the book about communication. It's one thing to interpret and get all the truths right, so you know what the text means, you know how it fits with the gospel storyline, but then how do you then structure it and organize it in a way that's clear, compelling, linear, and logical to your particular audience? So it requires you to be a designer that recognizes not only truth, but also goodness and beauty. And so what I recommend in the book is one model to do that in terms of the third part of the book, designing the sermon according to truth, goodness, and beauty. And I actually recommend this kind of a narrative model where you introduce a tension in the sermon and then resolve that tension through the gospel. So the fallen condition focus of the text is the first part of the sermon, and then the second part of the sermon is essentially the Christ-focused connection. And so that's just one way I think sermons can create that kind of tension that draws more attention as well as retention in the listener. I know this is long, so I appreciate you listening to all of this. But lastly, in addition to designing the sermon according to truth, goodness, and beauty, we also then want to deliver the sermon for maximum attention and retention for hopefully spirit-driven transformation. Because let's face it, not many people stay awake for the whole sermon, nor do they remember the whole sermon. In fact, studies have shown that if you ask an average churchgoer how much of their sermon do they remember, well, the percentage is around 7% of a sermon. It's very sad. So many of us preachers think, I'm sure my people are very different. I'm sure they remember at least 75% of my sermon. Not really. So that how do we then deliver the sermon, recognizing that God has wired our brains as speakers, but also as listeners, in ways that can actually increase attention and retention. And so I utilize, for example, brain science. I've done some research in neuroscience to try to discover ways in which we can design and deliver sermons for more attention, more retention. But again, I can't talk all about that, so you unfortunately have to buy the book to do that. It is translated into Korean, but hopefully this will be a blessing to you as you strive to be more faithful to your calling, to be a herald of Christ our King. But what a wonderful privilege we have to be God's heralds. And so my prayer is that the Lord will bless you as you do that better.